Good evening, dear friends. This is the last Thursday of March 2015, and we're in the Pine Gate Meditation Hall. Last time I talked to you, I introduced the Noble Eightfold Path and focused on the dynamics of Right View. Right View is a key component of this teaching from the Buddha. And I use the word dynamics carefully because right view directly impacts our thinking, our speaking, and our acting. So when our right view is not very healthy, it's going to be very unhealthy views that impact our thinking, speaking, and acting. And if we look at what's in our minds most of the time, and we say, what views are inside that brain, inside that mind, we come up with a jumble. Our views are made up of opinions, attitudes, perceptions, ideas, most of which have discrimination built into them. And our most strongly held views are usually about things that we're most ignorant about. I'll give you a classic and disturbing example of that. In the state of Florida in the US, the Republican governor has banned the word climate change because he doesn't believe climate change exists. So his officials will be suspended or fired if they use the word climate change. Now there's a strongly held view based on ignorance, based on the knowledge of 170,000 scientists around the world who are unanimous that we are facing climate change and we must take some radical steps in order to adapt. But when we have strongly held views based on ignorance, what then goes into our thinking, speaking, and action? Further ignorance. And this is why right view is at the heart of the Buddhist practice, because we're going to find the way of changing those views so that they become insights. But right view needs some help, and it gets its help from two other components of the Eightfold Path: right mindfulness and right concentration. When we develop our mindfulness and when we develop our concentration, when we stop multitasking and we do one thing at a time and do it well, we automatically create insights. So insights arise like a flower out of the fertile soil of mindfulness and concentration. And when we start to change the nature of the views in our mind so that they become insights, then something different carries through the dynamics. Do you follow me? Insights will pour into thinking, speaking, and acting instead of strongly held views based on ignorance. Now, the 8 components of the Eightfold Path, we could describe them as a zone of freedom. And once we cultivate all of them, we're stepping into awakening. We're putting our feet firmly on the Bodhisattva path. But we have work to do. Mindfulness, concentration, and insight are basic to transformation. I would describe them as the energies of transformation. But there's a sequence that's important. Insights are the product of deep mindfulness and deep concentration. And once we have insights, we drop all of those views that can cause harm. All the views that can damage and discriminate. So we have to recognize that, okay, we've got a strange bag full of views. what are we going to do about it? The key is to develop right view. And this is why right view is such a key component and has been emphasized by many scholars. It was spoken about by the Buddha in his first Dharma talk, but the deep investigation was by Sariputta. The Buddha did not monopolize the Dharma, especially when he had a brilliant disciple like Sariputta, who was considered as the foremost in wisdom. And his discourse on right view is what I'm drawing on this evening. So right view, if we want to develop, we have to carefully and selectively nurture the seeds that are in our consciousness. We could say that wrong view is when we foster unwholesome seeds, things like greed, hate, illusion, craving, anger, and violence, as opposed to right view. What right view does is to recognize wholesome seeds, like love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. It encourages their nurturing. And we could say of the first category, wrong view, this is when our views are unskillful. They're not in line with the Dharma. When we have right view, and we're cultivating wholesome seeds in our consciousness, then we have a skillful set of items in line with the Dharma. But there are 4 things I want you to consider in this exploration of right view. First of all, it's not an ideology. It's insight into the reality of life, which is made available by the depth of our mindfulness and our concentration. The second aspect to keep in mind is that our happiness depends on our degree of right view. Remember, the Eightfold Path is the path that the Buddha laid out so we could step out of suffering into happiness. And it depends on the degree of cultivation we've made of right view, whether we will be happy or not. And this makes sense because what is there in right view impacts or is recycled through our thinking, speaking, and action. So we have to be really very aware and precise about what we put into our minds and make sure it's insights rather than attitudes and perceptions that are damaging. So we can't really describe or teach right view to anybody because it is based on every individual's experience. Their experience of mindfulness and concentration, and how they then use their insights. This is what determines the level of right view in any individual. So the last thing about right view is you have to taste it for yourself. You have to taste the fruits of the work that you have done on your views. And then you can acknowledge that right view is expanding in line with the Dharma. So conceptual and intellectual knowledge is never enough. This isn't an intellectual exercise, it's very pragmatic. The experience of practice is required, and we notice that experience because we know when our rigidly held views are changing into insights. We know that when we don't make quite so many mess-ups. Because when we have unwholesome seeds in right view, when that is what is cultivated, our mind, our thinking mind, our speaking mouth, our actions in everyday life, often result in disaster. More suffering for the individual and more suffering for others. So right view and its development is a very pragmatic recipe. The other thing about right view that is important to carry with us in this discussion is that it's a deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So let me just reiterate that. The first noble truth is that there is suffering. The second noble truth is that there are causes and conditions that have created that suffering. The third noble truth is that well-being is possible, that we can get out of suffering. And the fourth noble truth lays out the path to move from suffering to happiness. And that path is the Eightfold Path. So again, this is a methodology and also a very practical, down-to-earth set of experiences. So we come on to Sariputta and his discourse, his very wise discourse on right view, and in particular his concentration on nutriments, the kind of nutriments we consume, and what does it do to us? What does it create? And he made the statement about nothing exists without food. In the context of transformation, I add something to that. Stop feeding your demons. Because your demons exist in your mind because you feed them. In some way, you cultivate their appetite. You fill them up, and then they continue to plague you. And you'll see why as we proceed. Now, last time I talked to you about this, I talked about edible food and sense impression food. These are the first two nutriments identified by Sariputta. Tonight I'm going to address the last two, the food of volition and the food of consciousness. Now, what is it, volition? What does that mean? It basically means it's a desire inside us to obtain whatever it is that we want. So, if our biggest desire is vengeance, then we're likely to become terrorists of one kind or another. If we want to be filthy rich and the president of a corporation, everything we do, say, is directed to that goal. But we can also have desires of a different nature. If we want a healthy planet, we're likely to be active environmentalists. And if we want to be a bodhisattva, if that's our desire, we take the steady steps into awakening. So how do we switch from terrorist to bodhisattva? Let's examine in some detail the cravings, the attachments, and the possessiveness that arise with unwholesome desires. Now, there's a graphic story about the Buddha and his monks walking past a jail, and all the prisoners were manacled and chained, and the Buddha said, are there any bonds stronger than what they had seen? All these manacles and chains all over the prisoners? And then he said to them, the bonds of craving and attachment are 1,000 times stronger than the manacles and chains that they've just witnessed. And we've had warnings from great masters throughout time about our cravings, attachments, and unwholesome desires. And I know when I reflect back on my own life, I can honestly say that I was most unhappy and devastated when I was caught by cravings, desires, and attachments. And from being stuck in that process, I certainly suffered, and I caused others to suffer. And we've probably all visited that territory at one time or another in our lives. And the Buddha is so clear. Dig up the root of craving. Don't let illusion crush you again and again as a flood crushes a reed. Now, what forms do our unwholesome desires take? It can run the whole gamut. It can be sensual pleasures. It can be having things, lots of stuff. It could also be nirvana. We're really attached to obtaining nirvana, and we forget to be present with what is there right now. So we have to be guarded in our attachments. It's not just the bad, unhealthy stuff that we can be attached to. We can be attached to awakening. We can be attached to nirvana. And in the process forget that all we have to do is be present. To be mindful. To be concentrated. It's really quite simple, but it's hard to do. So we need clarity to get out of these very big traps. Because we feel that we cannot be in the least bit happy until we obtain the object of our craving. There's always the want for more. And desires are cumulative and unlimited. When we crave for something and we get it, the pleasure lasts what? 30 seconds? Then we want something more, something bigger. So we have to be aware of that and then decide to do something different. And we need some clarity, mostly about the incorrect perceptions of ourselves that we carry around all the time. Because we rely on our senses, our perceptions and our mind, and that is a quagmire of illusion. We use our senses and mind to engage in flights of fancy, which are totally unreal. They're nothing to do with our presence right here, right now. And really, our flights of fancy are flights from the heart. And it's the heart and the consciousness of the heart that we want to expand and to rest in. So we have to deliberately foster a different quality of desire. We choose to awaken by deeply and fully living each moment from a state of presence. It sounds simple, but it's actually very quite difficult. Now, the desire cycle can only ever give us momentary satisfaction. It can never satisfy us. If we're caught in a desire cycle, nothing that we get will make us happy, because we want something more. And we stay caught in the process because we identify with false identifications, which we create with our ego. This is the mask that we use to paper over our deep-seated inadequacies. But we have to somehow de-identify with the desire process. How do we do that? Remember the Buddha's advice to his monks outside the prison. Dig up the roots of craving. Go back to your true nature through meditation, mindfulness, concentration, and daily, diligent meditative practice. These are the tools to get out of the prison. And that is it. Because once you rest in heart consciousness, you know everyone and everything is part of you. There's a whole web of Indra. You are in a state of interbeing with everything. You're far more than your identities. So when you have that realization that you're far more than the identities that you're clinging and holding on to, you reaffirm who you truly are. And in a sense, we cannot cut desires a little bit here, a little bit there. We have to dig out the root of craving. Okay, I'll only go shopping at Winners once this week. Okay? Instead of 3 times, which is what I normally do. No. You shop for what's essential. I hope too many people don't shop at Winners every week. So we need methodology, we need identifying the origins, and we have tools. One meditation that we do at Pinegate is the Sohama meditation, which can send healing energy to the attachments which we've identified. You know, we have to get smart. We identify what our attachments are and what it's doing to us. So in the Soham meditation, we just place attachment 1 through to 100, and we sort of just flood it with healing energy from the heart. So being caught by identities, it's not a small thing. I'm thinking of former Yugoslavia before it broke up, and your ethnic identity as a Serb, a Croat, a Bosnian, or a Muslim gave you license to kill anybody who wasn't of your ethnic identity. And it's exactly the same with ISIS. If you're not part of their Muslim jihadist identity, they are entitled to kill you. And we're far more than our identities to ethnicity. Far more than that. We just have to remember it. So somehow we have to short-circuit the mind process of who we think we are. And we have to move beyond the intellect, because our intellect protects our ego. It likes that mask. And we use our intellect in the most extreme ways to protect the mask that we have plastered over our real self. Our real self, who we are, is way beyond ethnic identities. Way beyond it. Because when we are holding fast onto an identity, there's the enormous tendency to discriminate. So we really have to take a good look at who we are. And I'm reminded of a story about Socrates when he was walking in the park in Athens, and he bumped into a citizen. And the citizen said to him, "Who are you?" And Socrates said, "I was just thinking about that." And there's a wonderful poem by Rumi. Let me read it to you. It's about identities. If this me is not I, then who am I? If I am not the one who speaks, then who does? If this me is only a robe, then who is the one I am covering? What this is getting at is that the ego defends a very limited view of self, one that often ends in disaster. And its logic is separation, the drive is manipulation and discrimination. This is a very pale and limited reflection of who we are. And on the question of discrimination, I remember I was giving a retreat in Chile. I think this was 1998. And Carol and I went down to Santiago to do a 3-week retreat. And we had to leave well before Christmas. So I got Christmas presents for my son Ian and my grandson Kellen. I sent them beforehand. And they opened them, and my son called me and said, "Dad, this is lovely, but why so early?" So I said that it would be too late to get them to him. And he said, "Well, what would you like us to send you?" And I said, "Well, you know what? You know what would please me the most, make me the happiest?" He said, "What?" Could you take the steps to show kindness to someone you have discriminated against? And there's a long silence at the other end of the phone. He said, "Dad, there's so many." So I said, "Look, please pick one." And he thought carefully about that. And on Christmas Day, he took a basket of food and flowers to a family that he had discriminated against. And they were so overjoyed. And he said he felt great, because it kind of rubbed out his discrimination from a previous time. And I ask all of you to do the same. If there's someone that you have discriminated against, for whatever reason, can you take the steps to remove that discrimination with an act of kindness? So with volition, we're into the quagmire of identities and not being caught by identities, especially when we see what being caught in identities does. ISIS, the former Yugoslavia, and similar situations all around the world are sufficient evidence of what happens when you're caught by identities. And that's part and parcel of the message about volition. Now let me come on to consciousness as food. You have a diagram of the realms of consciousness, but what I want to do is to start simply. The big circle here indicates the zone of consciousness, and is divided conveniently just into two: store consciousness and mind consciousness. Store consciousness stores everything. There's the good, the bad, the ugly, and the very ugly, all stored here. There's everything that our ancestors have done stored in there. We have Pol Pot and Hitler in there. But we also have the Buddha and Jesus in there. So it matters what seeds in our consciousness we choose to cultivate. So we have seeds such as anger. We have seeds such as mindfulness. And a simple model of healing that emerges from this is when anger comes up, when it's triggered by an external event or something internal. Anger comes up into our mind. And if we don't take care of it, the dog will suffer, or our spouse will suffer. So the Buddhist approach is to take care of the seed of anger. So you bring up the seed of mindfulness to take care of that seed of anger so that it falls back into the store consciousness with not quite so much energy. But if you have not developed your mindfulness, if it's something you've neglected, and anger comes up, and you try to apply mindfulness, it's like putting a flea on the backside of an elephant. Nothing's going to happen. You have to put in the work. Through mindfulness, concentration, and insight, you reinforce the seed so that mindfulness becomes powerful. So when anger comes up, you know, okay, I can use the Soham meditation, or I can use walking meditation, just to take hold of myself and to walk my anger out through my feet into the ground. But this is just the beginning of the Buddhist psychology about consciousness. And what it has led to, which is really very, very exciting, is the new science of neuroplasticity. In 1987, Francisco Varela, who is from Chile, he was a philosopher and a biologist. This is what he said in 1987. The chance of surviving with dignity on this planet hinges on the acquisition of a new mind. This new mind must be wrought, among other things, from a radically different epistemology, which will inform relevant actions. And Francisco Varela and the Dalai Lama, they created the Mind and Life dialogues, which brought Buddhist meditators into the labs of neuroscientists, and lo and behold, they found out that a trained mind in terms of meditation has a very different structure to an untrained mind. The Buddhist monks knew this all along, but the neuroscientists were simply proving it without recognizing that the mind is malleable. And if you want to change the structure of the mind, you can through diligent meditation, concentration, mindfulness. And since 1987, the whole area of neuroplasticity has just gone boom. It's the most exciting science in the world at this time. And the term neuroplasticity was coined to describe the phenomenon of continually adjusting and reorganizing brain neurons, synapses, and neural pathways. What this means is we are not stuck with the mind that has created such a devastating situation around the globe. We can change that mind, but it takes work. So neuroplasticity comes out of this simple model. But I have to prepare you that it gets more complex. Now, you have the diagrams in front of you of this. We have the store consciousness, which stores everything. We have the mind consciousness, which is our logical, everyday way of perceiving reality. Then we have the consciousness of each one of our sensory inputs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body. And the mind interprets what comes in through these sensory doorways. But there's something else in consciousness that is crucial to our understanding. There is another level of consciousness. This is called manas. All the negative seeds in consciousness, the best way I can describe it, they sort of glom together to create a new level of consciousness. Manas, which is based on distortion and illusion. It's the call center of judgment. But manas runs the mind. Remember, the mind interprets everything that comes through our sensory organs. When manas is running the mind, it means illusion, distortion, every negativity that you want to talk about, this runs the mind and interprets what comes in through the sensory organs. So everything is illusion until the mind decides to do something else. The mind can choose to cultivate mindfulness practice. We're going back to the mindfulness component and concentration component that feed into right view. But here, if we want to deplete manas, we practice diligently so that we cultivate our mindfulness practice, we reinforce all the wholesome seeds, we become skillful, and we start to weaken the unwholesome seeds in store. And that's the only way you get round manas. You dilute the seeds that created manas in the first place. Are you following me? Because this is really, really crucial. Because manas is about distortion. It runs the mind, which means that everything you interpret through your senses is illusion. It's incorrect. That is not reality. So you have to deal with manas by diluting the negative seeds that create it. So that's the end run, round manas. you cultivate mindfulness and concentration. And here we are, feeding right view again, okay? And by cultivating mindfulness and concentration, we reinforce the wholesome seeds in our consciousness, like love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. We become skillful in terms of cultivating what exists in the store. And the more and more we cultivate compassion, love, joy, and equanimity, remember this is malleable, it's plastic. It starts to dilute the energy from the negative seeds. So while your concentration is on transforming your attitudes and your values into insights, you are depleting the negative seeds, the unwholesome seeds in the store of their power. Each level is plastic, it's malleable. And we have to kind of trust what goes on in the store. We're not talking shrink to the mind, which passes for psychotherapy in many instances. We're talking about going from mindfulness practice right into the store to feed these wholesome seeds, reinforce them, make them stronger, dilute all the negative seeds, the unwholesome seeds that created manas in the first place. That's the only way you can do an end run around manas. And you know when it's happening, because from your deep mindfulness practice, from your concentration, you start to taste the fruits of your practice. You suddenly find out for yourself that, okay, that sticky situation with my colleague at work, I'm really handling it much better than I used to. I've got more calm, I've got more presence, I've got more patience than I ever had to. That's because you have invested time and effort into developing mindfulness, concentration, changing the set of attitudes in right view so they've become insight. A different dynamic is going through your thinking, through your speaking, and through your acting. So, with this particular model, which is very difficult to understand because it's actually more complex than this, which I don't want to get into in too much detail, but Thich Nhat Hanh has been very careful to say that transformation is at the base. Transformation is in the store consciousness. Okay? It doesn't happen with the mind. You transform in the base, which means that you have to be aware of what you're doing when you're choosing mindfulness practice and concentration. You know you're transforming the components of right view. You know you're weakening these unwholesome seeds that created manas. And when you know that, your practice becomes diligent, daily. Because this is the path you're walking on in order to produce a different dynamic. Through right view, into right thinking, into right speaking, into right action, into right livelihood. It seems like a no-brainer. Why would one do anything else? But we often have difficulties in recognizing that our views are damaging. And I think we have to get a few shocks along the line about how much our strongly held views have caused damage to people we care for. And then we realize, okay, I've got to do something about this. And it's to move out of it. And to describe the manner in which we deal with our consciousness, the Buddha has another graphic story. It's a murderer is brought before the king, and the king orders his soldiers to take him out and put 300 sword thrusts through him. And the captain comes back a little while, he's still living. So the Buddha says, okay, go and do another 300. And this carries on. And then his monks are wondering, what on earth is he talking about this time? And he basically says to them, this is what we do to our consciousness every day. Hundreds of sword thrusts into our consciousness every day. Unless we go, you find that it's not work, it's just joyful, because you see the difference that it makes. And that's where individual experience is so vital. And I'd like to finish this talk with a classic story from the Native American realm. My mentor, White Eagle Woman, told me this. She had a grandson who was being bullied at school. And he came home one day and he was mad he didn't have his lunch bag because these boys had taken it from him. And he said, I hate them. I want to kill them. I want to really do harm for them. And his grandmother looked at him and said, well, all your hate and your anger does not affect them at all, but it does affect you. And I can understand. When I was a little girl, I used to have the same kind of problems. It was as though I had two wolves inside me. One was a red wolf that was so nasty. It bit, it killed, it caused trouble. Then there was another wolf, a gentle timber wolf. And he made everything work. Everything was in harmony. And the little boy's eyes started to get rounder and rounder. And he said to his grandmother, oh, my grandmother, which wolf wins? And she took his hands in his face, and took his face in her two hands and said, oh, my grandson, the wolf I feed is the one that wins. Thank you for listening to me.